The channel is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis.
And I'm Mike Mateen.
Tonight, we are delving back into the world of lists of the best movies of all time. We started the podcast doing the American Film Institute's Top 100, but now we've been looking at the Sight and Sound Top 100 or top. I think there's 250 on there. It's not just 100, but we have selected from that list for this episode Rashomon, the 1950 Akira Kurosawa film, and The Third Man, the 1949 Carol Reed film, which are these are movies that I'm very excited to talk about both. Um, yeah. Rashomon was a movie that I had certainly heard a lot about. I think many people who have not seen it still know the name and the basic concept. Um, but The
I,
Third Man was an old favorite for me.
yeah. Well, I'd say even people who don't know the concept of Rashomon by that name
Hmm.
definitely know the concept, right? Even if they've
Yeah.
never heard it attributed to this name or film.
Hmm.
I mean, even Ocean's movies sort of have a little bit of this, right?
Oh,
Like
sure.
not
Yeah. Like the idea of using film to depict the story of an unreliable narrator instead of the tacit assumption that what we're seeing on screen is by default what really happened in the story.
right.
And that it was really kind of the first movie to really do that in such an effective way. I can't say that there's really no other movie that ever did it, but it's certainly the one that made everyone say, hey, you can do that,
Right.
among other things. Do we want to just jump right into Rashomon first? We could do them in
Yeah,
either order.
we can do that.
All right, well, let's do Rashomon then. So, as mentioned, when we were each picking from the list, this was the one that I picked, and I picked it because of exactly what we were just saying. It's famous for having this structure where we know crime has happened, and there's four different versions of the story, and we see depicted on screen the four different versions of the story as they're being told by the individuals, and they're different. And so, like, that's what I knew about it, but I had never actually seen it. We did Akira Kurosawa before when we did the Seven Samurai. Um, wasn't on the original list, right? Because that was American films. But we did do it as part of, we did the Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven and um,
Yep.
second Magnificent Seven. I'm trying to remember what the three were. But in any case, we've talked about Kurosawa before, um, and but this was his first like really big movie, and I thought it was really interesting. I will say, I think I was a little cooler on it than I expected the first watch. Partly maybe just because it was doing some things that were a little different than what I had thought it was going to be. But I had purchased the Criterion disc, and so I kind of dove into the special features and like learned a little bit more about it, and I've come to appreciate it more. But I think it's fascinating to talk about, regardless of whether you love it as a film to watch. What were your first impressions?
So that's why I kind of made the comment, like, even if you hadn't connected the term to this thing, like I'm sure I'd heard it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It was not immediately what came to mind. Like I wasn't going into it. I did not know what to expect going into it. I didn't have like I didn't connect it to the effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I got the pleasure of just going into it pretty cold, and it is really like I gotta say, if you go into it like with that, it is an amazing movie. Like I thought this was way better than, and I like the
Oh,
Seven
that's
Samurai.
that's that's great. I'm glad that was your reaction.
Yeah, like it. the way it sort of builds the mood. But again, remember, like if you don't know what's happening and they start in this rainy stoop in Rashomon, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the wood wood chopper guy and the
The
priest,
priest, and then the
and then
common man, and it's never really given a name or a title, but he's kind of a ruffian.
yeah, right, yeah, some sort of not necessarily homeless or whatever, but sort of
Mm-hmm.
a yeah, not a polished guy that just sort of
Yeah.
shows up in the stoop as
Yeah.
well.
I'll talk a little bit more about that guy in a moment when I talk about the short stories it's based on, but go ahead.
Okay, so just the mood that it creates with the raininess, and
Mm-hmm.
then and the acting that those two guys are doing, where they've just sort of got this, you can tell there's a defeated, like confused look more than just the rainstorm, but like just the
Mm-hmm.
attitude it builds with the rainstorm, which is why I think like why it all comes together really well at the end when the rain clears and all that, because it really like draws you in, like what is going on with these dudes, right? Like it's clearly more than just the rain that they're hiding out from.
Mm-hmm.
And then the guy comes and he says the same thing. He's like, "What's your guys' problem?" And they're like, "Well, there was a murder, and it's not like anything we've ever dealt with before."
Mm-hmm.
And that just like lays the table for this thing. And it's like, okay, and again, I didn't know what was going to happen, so I'm just kind of going watching the piece, and it's like, okay, where's the weird part going to happen? Well, this seems like a pretty straightforward, like there's the bandit and he
Mm-hmm.
rapes the girl, and obviously the samurai is distraught from the missing honor, and okay, and there's a duel, and he win, and it's like, okay, well that all seems pretty straightforward. I wonder what happens when he gets back. And then he goes to the police, he's interviewed, he's telling the story, and I'm still like waiting for like when's the interesting part.
Mm-hmm.
And then the girl shows up and she tells her story. I was like, oh, I get it. We're not
Mm-hmm.
sure what story's right. And it was just like the revelation of like
Yeah.
what had happened. And like then the anticipation of like, well, what's the next story? What's the next story? Are we going to
Mm-hmm.
get the full story? And I think that's one of the geniuses of this movie is we ostensibly get the correct story at the end because we get the witness account from the woodcutter,
Mm-hmm.
but yet he has different reasons why he may have not
Mm-hmm.
exactly told the right story
Yeah.
because
There's
he actually,
definitely, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So definitely the initial thing that the woodcutter and the priest, well, I think what we eventually realize is that the two of them are not necessarily having the actual same conundrum, because the priest is in a position of only hearing the different stories and not having had any sort of firsthand knowledge, right? And so, from his perspective, what he is encountering here is the caught thief, the wife of the samurai who is assaulted, and then we have a medium presented as telling the ghost of the killed samurai's version of the story. And within the context of the movie, that's presented as presumably as trustworthy an account as you would get if the guy were really there.
right. It's one of
So
those things where it's like it doesn't matter because
yeah,
at that point you've given the movie the credibility of what it's trying to do, and you need to hear the samurai's point of view, and they have
right,
to have a vehicle to get that to you.
yeah,
So you're just like, okay, this is it, right?
right.
Like this is how they're going to tell us his story,
But the
right?
the principal conundrum, though, is that essentially all three of these people take credit for killing the samurai.
Right.
Um, the thief says, "Oh yeah, well, I took the girl and I wasn't going to kill the husband, but then when I was going to leave, she said, "Oh, you have to kill him or kill yourself because I can't have two different men know what happened to me." And it's a whole thing about like the honor of it. There's a lot of one of the things I learned in some of the commentaries is that the whole stuff about like the idea that you would ever blame a woman for getting attacked that in this way, or thinking like she is ruined after that, is not necessarily what Japan thought of that at that time, but it's like a trope of these types of stories. And
Right.
so it's a big piece there, but I think it would have read to Japanese audiences as obviously as in a Western having two people do a duel at high noon,
Right.
right? Like it's a trope. But in any case, we have the thief decides to let the samurai go, and they have a duel, but the thief wins. But then when he's finished with that, the woman has run away anyway, and he's like, "All right, whatever, okay." And so he goes off and then, gets caught. But then the wife basically comes in and says, "No, what happened is that the thief assaulted me and then left. And when I went to go free my husband, he was looking at me with such hatred that I kind of freaked out and passed out, and I'm pretty sure that I killed him in that, that psychotic break." And then the medium comes in and has the samurai basically say, "My wife got assaulted, but it seemed like she actually liked it. And then she insisted to the thief that he must kill me so that she could run off with him. But the thief wouldn't do it because he recognized how dishonorable she was being. And so he left, and then she left too. And then I killed myself because of the dishonor." And so with those three stories, you can certainly understand why the priest, who is only there as a witness because he saw the samurai and his wife on the road earlier that day. That's the only reason he was there, listening to these accounts. But you can see why he's saying, like, not only do these three stories not match, but they're all taking credit for the kill. So, like, it's not even a case of just someone who did something is lying to say that they didn't do it. They're all saying that they did it. So they can't match, but like how can you make these stories line up? But then you have
Well,
throughout,
and there's
oh
one
yeah,
other
go
little
ahead.
piece
Mm-hmm.
I think is important to
Mm-hmm.
add that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that also everyone in all three of those accounts, he's killed by the dagger, but yet they never found the dagger.
The thief says he killed him with the sword, but yeah,
That's right. You're right.
yeah,
You're right. Okay. So,
yeah.
but yeah, in the other two accounts,
Mm-hmm.
and then the next one, he's killed by a dagger that was not recovered,
Mm-hmm.
but everyone insists was there and was the weapon that killed him.
Yeah. Well, and then specifically too, the end of the samurai's story is that as he lay there dead, he couldn't see who it was, but someone came and took the dagger out of his body.
Yep.
And so that's a detail of like what happened to the dagger is kind of a theme throughout, because even when the thief says that he used the sword to kill him in the duel, he remembers the dagger because it's the dagger that the wife had used to try to defend herself, and he had noted it because he found it kind of exciting how, fierce she was. And then it also, the dagger looked valuable, and the thief, we should point out, is the only character with a name, which is kind of interesting, Tajo Maru, played by Toshiro Mifune. And this was, again, like not his first movie, but this was kind of like, this being Akira Kurosawa's first big movie, this was like the first big movie for Toshiro Mifune. And like he's making some big choices in this movie. The thief, this bandit he's playing is manic, perhaps got some. He's almost like a child, right? Like he does not seem fully developed intellectually, or he's got some issues going on, but he is like completely uncontrite. Thought the whole thing was funny, and he's constantly laughing. And so, like, the end of his whole statement is they ask him about the dagger, and he's saying, "Oh yeah, that dagger looked valuable. I should have remembered to take it with me. That's the biggest mistake I made." So even though he's basically saying, "I assaulted this woman and killed her husband, and then I got caught, and now I'm going to be put to death," the biggest mistake he made, according to him, is forgetting to take the valuable dagger. But yeah, so it's this theme though of, she says that it was her dagger that she used to kill him, And then the samurai says it's the dagger that he used to kill himself, and then someone took it, and the dagger was not recovered. And so that's part of something that, like, if you're following it like a murder mystery, that is kind of a loose end in there. And
Yep.
so we have, as you mentioned, we these guys at the rainy Rashomon Gate is so at the time in which the story is set, the city of Kyoto had gone through a bunch of different disasters in a relatively short period of time, and it was just a mess. And so we see one of the big gates that apparently, if it were like the real one at that time, looking through the gate, you should have actually been able to see like the Imperial Palace in the distance. Now, they didn't do that in the set, which is not a big deal. But this big, elaborate gate is half destroyed, which is a whole other thing with the production that I'll get into maybe in a bit. But they're listening. We're hearing the priest and the woodcutter retell these stories as they heard them. But throughout, the reactions of the two are different because you have the priest who's basically just saying, this whole thing is making me lose my faith in humanity. Everyone seems so terrible, and they're all lying, and I don't understand why. The woodcutter is mostly hung up on they are lying. So they're telling this story, but they're lying. It's full of lies. And the guy being told these stories is kind of saying, "You seem really sure that they're lying for someone who supposedly didn't see anything." And he had been in the at the court proceeding because supposedly he found the body after everything had gone down. But so then, after we hear those stories, eventually this commoner guy who's listening confronts the woodcutter and basically says, "Look, I can tell that you are holding something back, and that it's bothering you. Look, you didn't. Okay, I get it. You didn't want to get involved. You didn't want to say anything to the court. But like, what are we? We're just three guys hanging out at a old gate in the rain right now. Why not tell me?" And so then we hear the fourth version of the story, which is that this woodcutter apparently did not only find the body after the fact, but he witnessed the whole thing going down. And we see a different version where, in some respects, it kind of aligns with the three, like, different pieces of the three first stories we heard. In the sense, there's the assault, there's the woman who seems to show some equivocation over like how she actually wants it to go afterwards, like who she would want to leave with. The samurai certainly suggests that she is now unworthy because of this happening to her. But he does say that there was still a duel, and he's very specific that there was a big duel, and it was that the Tajomaru killed him with the sword. And he's like very insistent on that point. But it's funny because we see this duel. The first one was sort of the classic, like you would imagine an old movie samurai sword fight happening. This one is like they're both scared, they're tentative, they don't really want to be fighting. It's like hard Scrabble. They're making mistakes, they're falling down, and it's kind of just more like grubby it's almost like a parody, with all of the things happening. But then, of course, what happens is that this commoner who's been listening to the whole story has picked up on this thread of the dagger and has been saying, "Funny how they didn't find this valuable dagger afterwards. You sure you didn't touch anything after all this happened?" You seem pretty insistent. "Oh no, it was definitely the sword that killed him. You don't know what happened to the dagger?" And so it's suggested that we assume that means that even this supposed witness testimony that's supposed to be the real story can't have been the real story, or at the very least he has left something out, because he's protecting himself as well, because we imagine he probably did steal the dagger, whether he stole it from the samurai's body or picked it up somewhere else. He did take it. And in fact, it's actually one thing when I rewatched it after watching some of the special features, the scene where the samurai is talking about how he felt someone take the dagger, you can see the woodcutter reacting in the background. Like he is nervous, he's stressed, he feels like is this medium going to suddenly turn around? Like when we know, we can interpret his reaction as though like he's worried he's just about to get called out. And
Right.
then when it doesn't happen, you see him kind of react with like, oh. And so it's interesting when you rewatch, you can actually see him reacting to that specific detail pretty deliberately. Like I certainly missed it in my first viewing, but watching it the second time, it's very clear. Um, and so you just to kind of finish summarizing the plot, after there's this confrontation, the woodcutter is basically trying to still deny it, trying to say that this guy, you don't know, you weren't there. It was, and you're just a no good person anyway. And they're kind of yelling back and forth at each other, and they're getting all rained on. But then they all hear a baby crying, and it appears that there is an abandoned baby at the gate here, and the guy this commenter who's been listening to all the stories promptly steals all of the fancy clothing and like goods that were left with the baby, just literally like picks the baby up in order to take the silk kimono that it was lying on, and then puts the baby back down. And he basically defends, like, look, we're all just trying to get by. You can't pretend that you're any different when you stole the dagger, right? And then so he runs off back into the rain, and then we have the priest and the woodcutter left to sort of deal with this new thing. And so I guess we're just describing the whole plot now. So, but it's a movie that feels like that's part of what you need to do to discuss it, because it's so much about all of that. But I think one of the things that's kind of amazing about this movie, like the more you think about it, because you can certainly enjoy it on like the level of just watching it, but then there's also just this idea of like the meta of what movies are and how they work, and the realization that there's actually multiple layers, because what we are seeing on screen, say, in the first story, is the woodcutter and or the priest, because it's a little bit clear which of them is actually telling the story there at the Rashomon gate. But they are repeating their experience of seeing Tajumaru relate his own experience of what really happened. Right? And then on top of that, we are watching a movie depicting all of that. And so there's lots of different layers of the reality of the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting points, like you brought up earlier, is the sort of pondering, why did they all choose to take credit? Like, what does that
Mm-hmm.
say? Like, and then all, so that I thought was interesting, and then the final piece I thought was interesting is that so often now the idea in this kind of theme is that just like in this movie where it's ostensibly the last story should bring it all together, it's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
here's what really happened. You've seen all these pieces, you kind of understand it.
Yeah.
But in this movie, that's it. It's not what really happened, and so
Mm-hmm.
we're sort of left with like, how did this all come together? Like, which parts of which stories are true? Because
Mm-hmm.
clearly, there's enough things that happened that we everybody can agree on,
Yeah.
right? But what ended up really happening, and I get it doesn't matter, but it's still like you're left with this like you kind of want to know the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think that like there's some stories in the production about like some of the people working on the film coming up to the director and saying, "We don't understand. What is this movie trying to say?" And him basically saying, "No, no, it's being made so that you understand." But at the same time, it is obviously. But what I think it kind of comes down to, what kind of resolves it in some respects, is that we all have kind of an instinctive expectation that what the movie is about finding out what really happened. And the idea that everybody's is a little bit wrong, and then we're going to find out what really happened. But the movie's actually kind of not really doing that, right? It's specifically saying not only just about these four people telling the story, that they all cannot help to but to shape the story, including lies, even when they're telling it to themselves,
Right.
because it their own sense of self is so ingrained that they can't help but reflect on their own experiences through that filter. And it's more broadly saying it's not just these four people that do that, but that it's everybody that does that. And that is like, and that's where we come into like some of the ways that Rashomon has become influential in this regard, is not merely the many different movies and TV shows and everything that have kind of adopted this format, even though usually what those are doing is what we just described, where it's like three that are not quite right, and then you see what really happened, right? Like most of the time when a show is doing a Rashomon episode, that's kind of how it goes, and it's less about like what really happened, or rather, like they make it all about what really happened. But
Yeah.
but here, you also have Rashomon get name checked in court proceedings to acknowledge the fact that it's easy to say that when you have a witness testifying about what they saw, that if any actual like forensic evidence contradicts anything that they say in their witness testimony, it's easy to assume that means they were lying, like deliberately. But often, people's memories are just very malleable in that way. And they remember things differently. They notice different things in their brain. Like, there's neurology to back this stuff up, is that, like, the way we perceive the world um, in our brains is different than what our actual senses experience, because our brain processes it all together. Like when they do eye tracking studies, we imagine that we are seeing this continuous image around us, but when they do these studies, your eyes are actually only seeing like a small amount at any given instant, and they're just always kind of moving around, and it's your brain that stitches it all together. But that also means that sometimes if you did not actually look right at something, it might be that your brain just fills in what you would expect to be there, and then you remember it being there even if maybe it really wasn't,
Yep.
or vice versa. How many times have we all said, I cannot find my keys. I thought I left them on the counter, but I've checked the counter 5 times. And then where do you find them? On the counter, right? Because just somehow you just didn't look in the exact right spot, and your brain kept filling in empty counter or whatever. Like this happens. This is like real. And
Oh
so,
yeah. Well, yeah, and I think just to piggyback off of that, like that was another one of the things that I love so much about this movie is it just takes something that is a true reality thing and
mm-hmm,
it like uses the medium of film to like hyper focus on it,
mm-hmm,
right? And I mean it's something that I mean we talk about it like all the time. Like it's that's how most conflicts between people who actually care about each other, like who
mm-hmm,
legitimately don't want to get into a conflict, is because they're coming at something from a different perspective.
mm-hmm,
The exact same events happened,
yeah,
but if I have a stressful day at work and my boss put something that's due on me, and and all these things are happening, and and my wife is at home and she's expecting a certain thing, and then like when we both get home and have a conversation,
Mhm.
and her day and my day were so different that we could be saying the exact same things to each other and it could mean totally different things to each other
Yeah.
because we come from two different places.
Right.
And like so it's a thing that like in relationships you have to work on is like, okay, and the thing that like the mantra we always use is like assume the best, right? Like just always assume the other person isn't trying to like
Right.
do something wrong, right?
Because by and large, that's
Yeah.
usually going to be correct. Is you don't have other people usually. Most people are not going around trying to think of how they can screw people over. Like that's like there are going to be exceptions, sure, but that's the exception rather than the rule. And but
That's why I like
yeah,
use the like people who are like, who care about each other when there
yeah,
is conflict between them is because like they definitely don't want to screw each other up. Neither of them is trying to hurt each other, right? When
yeah,
it's two friends or in a relationship or any of this kind of stuff, it's just like when you're so set that like how you see the world is the way the world is and don't accept that like they're seeing the exact same day,
hmm,
they just have all this other
right,
perspective that's coming in,
yeah,
and that's like what leads to it. And so like something that's a little fuzzy, like in real life, where you have to really like work at,
hmm,
like the way this movie just like made it so stark was
hmm.
awesome, you
Right.
know?
And so like that is where we can like imagine like in between all of these different versions of the story, we could like say what is going on with the wife, right? She's clearly been assaulted, right? And like that's unambiguous, that part of the story. It seems consistent throughout, but at the same
Yeah.
time, there
The
is no
samurai
ref-
got captured, the wife got assaulted, the samurai got killed. These are the
yeah.
three beats we all know happened,
Right.
right?
But how the samurai got killed is generally the place where they all kind of
Yep.
differ more. But for example, where we had the Tajumaru, the bandit, saying she was fierce, she fought back, and like I'm an expert, so I was able to still beat her. But it was really exciting to me how much she fought back and how tough she was, and she threatened me with a dagger, and I had to chase her around. It was cool, and like that's his like take on this whole thing. Um, and then of course also his version that but then by the end she was actually kind of digging it, like she kind of thought, hey, maybe you're so tough, you're better than my husband, so maybe you could like if you kill him I could go with you, right? But then we also, like that's, we can imagine the bandit's ego filling all of that in. But then we could also just imagine without having to get any kind of, really, lurid stuff about like the assault itself. We could imagine that part of what's happening with her is that once it's clear she's not going to be able to physically resist him, she is kind of stops fighting because she can't do anything and she's just helpless, right? But we could imagine that being seen from her husband's perspective of, oh, is she's not fighting anymore? Does that mean she likes it? And and of course, we can, this is a 1950 movie. We don't see anything graphic, mostly just forced embraces and that sort of thing. But we could imagine how like the little things that she's trying to do in just trying to figure out how to navigate this situation get misread on the part of both her husband and the bandit, and she's just trying to figure out, well, and we can also imagine that like because in her version of the story there is no point at which she ever considers even remotely thinking that she might go um, with the bandit, right?
Right.
Like that's like it does not even enter the story as to even to be dismissed. The bandit runs away. She goes straight to her husband, and then he's just disgusted with her, which she can't handle. Um, and so like that's just there's all these, we can just see how we can kind of start to put together how some of that might have just been interpreted differently. But some pieces of it, like was there or was there not a duel where the bandit killed the samurai with the sword, right? Um, we could imagine, for example, that she just sort of passed out and wasn't aware of it. And so she assumed she must have killed him because she saw him dead from a blade wound and thought, I must have done it because I had my dagger before and now I don't remember doing it, but that must be what happened, right? So we could imagine that, even if, for example, she was passed out when the duel happened, right? But then that still doesn't line up with what, the samurai says from, his spirit. Like, why wouldn't he have said that, right? So it is, I think, carefully constructed so that it really can't be pieced back together into something that aligns with all the different versions of the story.
Yep.
And because what the movie is really kind of ultimately trying to do is not to say, let's figure out together, let's solve this puzzle and figure out what really happened, but to reflect that everyone who tells the story is doing so from their own perspective, and that it is inherent to human beings to, to interpret and filter everything they do and say through their own self-image. And this all ties back into the very last bit of the plot that we didn't get into, which is that after the commoner runs away with the kimono stolen from under the baby, the priest at this point is feeling lower than ever before, because not only was this whole traumatic murder happened, but now, oh my God, someone abandoned a baby, and oh my God, this guy just stole clothes from them, and like everybody is the worst, right? And so in that moment, he's holding the baby, and the woodcutter starts to like reach for the baby, and he's thinking like, what are you going to do? You're going to steal from the baby even more now? But the woodcutter instead is just saying, I have 6 kids already. I could have a 7th. It would be fine. And, so like he's reaching for the baby because he's going to take care of this poor abandoned baby. And the priest is suddenly just realizing that people are complicated and that that's okay. Like the idea that maybe this woodcutter stole the knife and then lied about it does not make him a terrible person. And then it's kind of in that moment that the rain finally clears, and so it's kind of interesting. I think it's a neat movie. I wanted to talk a little bit about, because part of the Criterion Collection includes a little flip book that has the 2 short stories that it's based on, because it's actually adapted from 2 different stories. One is called From a Grove, and that's the main story of the crime that happened and the different versions of the story. But that story is it's just the 3 versions. It does not have any of the framing device. It is written like a court transcript of those 3 different accounts. But from that perspective, it's pretty similar. Like it's pretty much aligns with the story, but it is only that part. And that one's From a Grove, and then Rashomon, the one that's from a title, is actually much more changed, because it starts by taking the same sort of location, which is this ruined, abandoned gate that is being used by some people to get out of the rain. But the rest of the story is very different because, of course, it's like, it's not bringing in this other story. But in that one, what we have is a guy who has basically lost his previous line of work because of all the disasters in Kyoto, and has basically decided that maybe all that's really left to him is to become a thief, but he's having some moral qualms about that. Like he's not sure he's ready to devote himself to that. And then what he actually runs into is a woman who is part of what's happening there is that you have bodies that have all also been left abandoned at the gate. And that's kind of referenced in the movie a little bit, but we don't see it. And he comes across a woman who is stealing hair from corpses to make wigs with, to sell, to try to make a living. And he at first has this horrified reaction. How could you steal from the dead? This is degrading, it's desecrating, it's disgusting. And he's having this reaction, and he's like, going to attack this old lady for doing this horrible thing. And then she gives him basically like the whole story of like, well, look, I'm trying to do what I can to survive with all of this stuff. And sure, many people might say what I'm doing is bad, but I'm just trying to survive. And his reaction to that is saying, oh, so that's okay to do that then, to take what you need just to survive? In that case, I'm taking everything you have and I'm going to be a thief. And that's the story. And so, in some ways, we could imagine this commoner in this one, especially ending with his challenging of the woodcutter of saying, "Oh yeah, well you steal a knife, I'm going to steal these clothes." Is a little bit aligned with that, but in a different context. But I just thought it was kind of interesting to look at those pieces.
Yeah,
Dogs making excited noises.
I mean, one of my dogs is a coonhound, so
Yeah.
he has an interesting vocalization.
My goodness.
Blue.
He wants to argue all about Rashomon. He has his own version of the story of what happened in the Grove.
Yeah, you do? What's your story? I know your brother's ridiculous. I get it.
um, some of the other stuff that's just interesting about the production, I think, is that there was kind of a funny anecdote about how when Kurosawa is trying to get, like various budget stuff approved for making this movie, uh, he basically said, "Well, we only need to build one set," and the producers was like, "Oh, okay, great." And then, of course, the set that he's having built is this gigantic ruined gate, which in some respects is a lot harder to build than an actual completed nice looking gate because it's huge but dilapidated. And if you don't build it right, it's just going to collapse and be unsafe, right? So you have to build something that is huge, sturdy enough to be safe to work on, but looks like a gate that the big, huge wooden structure that's falling apart. And it was so this is big ordeal to finish it, and like the set designers eventually saying, I would have rather built 10 normal sets. And then there was also discussion about all the rain is literally just people off screen with fire trucks and having the hoses just spray into the air. That's what the rain is, which is of course I think generally how that effect was done at that time.
Yep.
But they had a couple. They talked a lot about there's being a couple of shots where the rain against the cloudy sky doesn't read. You can't really see rain against the cloudy sky. It just gets washed out. And they tried to have the rain look more obvious on screen by putting ink in it to limited effect. There's a couple of shots that they point out. Well, you can kind of see it kind of works there, but mostly it didn't work so much because everything that the rain, like you can't really see the ink very much in a falling raindrop, but you sure see it when it lands on anything else, and then that thing is now covered with ink. So, but yeah, so those were just a couple of details from some of the production stuff.
Those are
Um,
cool.
but yeah, and so for such a movie that's been so influential in terms of creating almost like a plot structure that has been used over and over again, giving language to concepts that can be hard to deal with, just like the idea that witness testimony can be unreliable without any intentional dishonesty, because people can't help but filter things through their own experiences. And then just kind of framing all of that into a story about, like, this is just what humans are, and it's a little bit, it's unhelpful to get too upset about it because can't be avoided. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, Anything else that you want to?
No, I gotta explain. Said what I felt, and I enjoyed
Mm-hmm.
it. So
Great. All right, so let's move on to The Third Man. And this is one that I could talk about endlessly because I've seen it a dozen times and love it. But I want to hear you talk about it some more because it was your choice, and I want to hear what you thought about it.
so to kind of not that both of these movies don't have, not that Rashomon doesn't have awesome like set design
Mm-hmm.
and all that, like you were talking about that, and not that the Third Man doesn't have an interesting plot, but that's the plot is not what's awesome about the Third Man. Like it's part of what
Mm-hmm.
gets it moving. It's like this movie does things with light and angles and music
Mm-hmm.
and acting that just creates a mood that just draws you into the movie,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the plot, yes, it's interesting enough to kind of keep you moving along, but that's not what makes this movie great in my
Mm-hmm.
mind. Like this movie is just a visceral like experience of just being drawn in, right? Like it
Yeah.
is, yeah, the film noir that it leans into
Mm-hmm.
is the way it uses black and white, hey buddy, and lighting and the set piece of Vienna, and the way the characters interact within that texture, right? Like it's just such a work of art,
Mm.
more so than just like what happens.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, It sounds like you liked it, which I'm glad because
I've always liked
it's
this
it's
movie,
awesome.
yeah.
Had you seen it before? I thought you hadn't.
Oh no, I've seen this movie many,
Oh,
many times.
okay. Well, so for some reason I don't know why I misunderstood then. So I okay, that's cool.
Yeah,
It's a great movie to discuss. I think I just misunderstood. Well, in that case then, um, I
yeah.
just
I mean, so the
yeah. Go ahead.
basic plot beats are that Joseph Cotton, who has sort of an ambiguous, what is his name, Holly Martins,
Holly
Martin.
Martins, yeah,
Yeah,
it's framed in the story as an unusual name.
yeah. So he has it doesn't actually matter,
Yeah.
but anyway, Martins arrives in Vienna
Mm-hmm.
because he's taking a job from Harry Lime, who is Orson Welles.
Mm-hmm.
When he arrives, he finds out that Harry Lime is dead, and he goes to his funeral, but he decides to stick around since he's already got this trip paid for,
Mm-hmm.
and he wants to maybe figure out what happened in his
Well,
death.
what he decide the first thing he decides to stick around for is because Calloway, when a British police officer working in Vienna, tells him, "Did you know that your
Oh, right.
friend was involved in racketeering and he's actually a terrible, awful
That's right. I
criminal?"
forgot that
And
happened right
yeah,
at
and
the start.
so Holly is basically saying, "I'm going to prove you wrong. You're just trying, you're taking advantage of the fact that my friend died to try to pin unsolved crimes on him."
Right. So he's going to prove him innocent by
Yeah.
how he died. And then so he starts investigating it, and he's an author who writes, these types of books so that like make
Westerns. Yeah.
westerns, yeah.
Mhm.
So everybody kind of knows him, and he easily befriends multiple types of people from, high level barons to the doorman. And the interesting part is when he's speaking to the doorman about what happened and they're talking about the death, he says, well, he's like, no, that the way that they described it isn't what actually happened. There was a third man that helped
Mhm.
carry his body away.
Yeah. It's kind of funny that we ended up doing Rashomon and Third Man together in some respects.
Right, because there's multiple versions of the,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
of how Harry Lime was after he got killed and how he got
Right.
carried away.
Yeah, cuz Holly hears first from the friends that were with Harry when and saw it happen. And so he hears that story first and they're saying, Oh yeah, so like one of them was with Harry on one side of the street, the other friend was on the other side of the street, called out to him, and Harry stepped into the road to go see the other guy and got hit by a car. And that's the first version of the story he hears. But yeah, as you mentioned, the porter who saw the thing from an upper window is saying, "No, there was a third person there that is not included in any of the other stories you heard." So who's that? Who's the third man? And that's where, of course, the title comes from.
Exactly. And then we get some, which again they're important, but it's not what makes the movie awesome. Is that it turns out like the racketeering was about stealing penicillin,
Mm-hmm.
putting it, selling it on the black market. Like so, it's like his buddy wasn't doing great things, which I think is the important part. Is that like Harry Lime had gotten himself involved in things that were like
Yeah.
were not acceptable, right? It
Well, I there's a great sequence where Calloway, who has been in some respects perceived as an antagonist early on, because he's kind of severe, and from Holly's perspective, he's trying to frame his dead friend. We don't like him, but eventually Calloway just calls him in and says, "Okay, look, sit down, have a cigarette, have a cup of coffee. I'm going to show you 1,000 files that proves everything that I'm saying about him is true." And there's a sequence where it's just a montage, and it's a great montage because it's just showing like all of these different things. They've got like secret code phrases. They're looking at fingerprints. They're showing little penicillin vials, and we just included in this montage is Holly kind of just increasingly going, "Ugh," because essentially the montage conveys, I think, very effectively to us, the audience, is like, oh no, he definitely did it. This is not a frame job. They're very sure that it was really him that
right.
that did all this stuff.
Which again, because that's not the point of the movie,
Mm-hmm.
isn't whether or not he did it.
Right.
It's like what happened to him
Mm-hmm.
and who is this third man,
Right.
right? And so,
Yeah.
you know,
Because Holly is still thinking all of these suspicious details. Maybe it's because he was murdered, right? It wasn't an accident, especially because he learns from a girl that he saw at the funeral who apparently was Harry Lime's girlfriend.
yeah, the actress.
She is talking about like, no, you're right that there's funny details about it, and I was frustrated with that too, but I couldn't do anything. Um, she's pointing out is like, oh wait, and also the driver of the car that hit him was Harry's driver, and it was Harry's doctor who just happened upon the scene later and was able to pronounce him dead. That's starting to feel like an unlikely coincidence.
Which builds into, one of the best scenes in the movie, right? So
Mm-hmm.
after the whole thing where it's revealed to him that he clearly was doing something wrong,
Yeah.
Holly decides that he's going to leave, and so but he's kind of got a thing for Anna, the
Mm-hmm.
girlfriend. So he's just going to go say goodbye to her, whatever. But as he's, going to talk to her, like he's seeing this shadowy figure sort of following him,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
then, he kind of, there's a whatever, it all builds really cool, but
Mm-hmm.
he eventually like looks back and, there's just the way the light goes reveals the man who's
Yeah.
following him in the dark, and it turns out it's Harry Lime.
Right. And we get just this incredible reaction shot from Harry realizing that he's been made.
Right.
Um,
And then
uh,
run.
yeah,
Yeah.
and this is Orson Welles, perhaps at his hottest. I mean, he's a good-looking guy in this movie for sure, and he's extremely charismatic in his role, even though he is objectively playing a terrible person.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, like that sequence is amazing because there's so many little details that we wouldn't necessarily piece it together even if we understood everything happening at the same time. But like there's the cat that had been previously established as, it was technically supposed to be Anna's cat, but the cat liked Harry more than anyone else, and it wouldn't be affectionate with anyone but Harry. And we see the cat going out, and we see this shadowy figure lurking across the street in the doorway, but we see the cat like nuzzling up to the feet of this individual. Um, and it is partly the cat doing that is what when Holly's leaving and walking the street, like that's what kind of makes him notice that somebody's standing there. And so he's yelling at him. It's like, because he thinks this is just some thug that's following him. He's like, I know you're there. You know, you might as well give it up or just come out and talk to me. And he doesn't know it's Harry. He's frustrated with people, treating this like a conspiracy without it. Holly Martins is such an interesting character that I want to come back to in a moment. But it's because he's yelling that someone in one of the upper windows turns on their lights to
Right.
complain, and that's what the light reveals Harry. And I think it's just funny the whole way that sequence builds. It's incredible. Um, but
And
yeah, let's talk about Holly a little bit because he is a very atypical noir lead, I think, or maybe not that atypical for noir, but like he's kind of a sad sack, right? Like he is two steps behind every other character in this movie. And yet and like every time he takes initiative to do anything, he's total bull in a china shop mode. But in some respects, that is the only reason that the case gets broken is because everyone has got all of their nifty little games and subterfuge and cloak and dagger stuff. All these little games are lined up and running their own little loops, and he just charges through all of it and it disrupts everything.
yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Is that like he brings a sort of outsider perspective, but then like the idea of him being like a sad sack and like sort of behind and everything, and like
Mm-hmm.
I think is what makes the ending, which we hadn't got to because we don't have to do
Yeah,
just
well,
plot beat, but it's what makes it so powerful, right?
mm-hmm.
Is that like he has to step into that world,
Mm-hmm.
but not because he got wrapped up in that world, but because it ended up being like he came into it with like he goes into it with like the hero stance of it. Like he comes into it and he does what's the
Mm-hmm.
right thing. Ultimately, like we can talk about it. I mean, it's no
Well,
spoiler,
yeah,
but
I mean, his
ultimately
dilemma.
he has to kill Harry.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, so like his dilemma going into Act 3 is he's been convinced that Harry was actually a dangerous criminal or like scummy criminal who's like diluting penicillin is like to make a buck. The main problem with that other than is that it makes the penicillin not work, and so that people
Right.
who are supposed expecting to get better on penicillin don't, and in some cases if it was diluted with bad stuff might actually get actively worse. And there's a bunch of kids that really suffer from it, and that's ultimately kind of what persuades him that it's like, no, we need to stop this. This can't be allowed to continue. But at the same time, though, there's one thing. It's one thing to say, my old friend has gotten into some really awful crimes, but am I willing to be the one to tell him that I'm going to work with him, but I'm really setting him up to get arrested? Because that's kind of a profound personal betrayal that is asking a lot of
Yep.
an old friend, right? And so his dilemma is like I obviously don't approve, but am I willing to be the one who sets him up by lying to his face? Um, and especially because Anna is there all along, which I think it's fun and the right move that as much as Holly kind of starts to fall for her, she really just never gives him anything back in that regard. She is not does not show any interest in him at all, except in that, he also knew Harry, and so she can talk about Harry with him. That's really like, otherwise she's not interested. But like her position there is a little more nuanced. We kind of can't, we're left to wonder a little bit because she doesn't seem like she approves of that either, but she is less able to let what he's done make him into a different person in her heart, right? Like she
Right.
loved him and kind of can't help still loving him even when he's done these awful things. And so, like all of that is kind of playing into this last act where there's the big, you know, uh, you know, the betrayal happens. There's an incredible foot chase through all of these incredible locations. You were kind of getting into this, but the fact that they were making this movie in post World War II Vienna, where just by virtue of it being post World War II Vienna, when they were making the movie, they have access to all of these locations, which are, I'm sure not fun for the Viennese at that time, but are amazing locations for films, which is all of these bombed out buildings still full of rubble and ruins and everything that are just like interspersed with ordinary cobblestone streets. And then it has this incredible sewer system too that they shoot some stuff in the foot chase in, and it's amazing. And some of the places. One of the cinematographers was saying what he loved about some of those locations is that because there weren't any actual lights in them anymore, they could just put lights wherever they wanted.
I mean, and you can tell they did, right? Like
Mm,
it's such a artistic
yeah. Lots
way that
of
it
lights
looks.
casting huge shadows of people on the walls and stuff.
Yeah, lots of shadows. And even the light scenes, like the fact that like it, yes, it makes sense in the plot why they meet each other on the Ferris wheel,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, it's
But
private. Yeah.
right,
Mm-hmm.
that's not why the movie does it,
Yeah.
right? Like just that is
Mm-hmm.
such a cool experience when there's like this tension between them and like
Mm-hmm.
the thing will ride, like how Ferris wheels work, right? Like it'll be
Yeah.
going for a while, then it'll kind of abruptly stop, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see
Yeah.
the
Oh
all of
yeah.
Vienna in the background, like
So many layers of what makes that scene cool.
yeah, like they literally could have done that same scene
Mm-hmm.
in like the back table of a coffee shop, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't. They chose not to, and
Right.
that's what makes this movie exciting. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like I said, and I'm not saying the plot is bad by any means. It's not.
Oh
It's
sure.
good, interesting.
But it's straightforward. It's a structure to hang all of these interesting details on, right?
Hmm.
Because like ultimately, what is the plot is like, oh, we think there is a murder, but it turns out it was not a murder. It was a fake death. And then you have someone who needs to help catch the criminal, and everything else is just the moving pieces that build that story. But yeah, the Ferris wheel, because not only is it just interesting visually, right? But it's just like you said, like the motion of it kind of can mirror the ebbs and flows of the conversation and the different emotions going on there. It allows a hint of danger with the suggestion that maybe Harry would push Holly out of the Ferris wheel car, but then also the ability to look down and see people as these tiny little dots. And he has the whole bit of it's kind of like, listen, I hear what you're saying about people getting hurt, but look down and at all of those people down there. Are you going to tell me that if I could give you, whatever the number was, like $1,200 cash free or tax free, for if one of those dots stopped moving, are you saying you would really tell me to keep my money? And just and that whole thing
Well,
is all facilitated by being in the Ferris wheel.
right, and you kind of hit on like the duality of like the tension there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he's pointing out the people in the dots, but there's also that tension of like, oh, hey, look down.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, if he
Look how
looks
high
down,
we are. Yeah.
yeah, look how high we are. Like, if I look down, will I get pushed out? Like, if I'm
Mm-hmm.
not paying attention, will he
Yeah.
attack me? You
Cause,
know,
well,
like
cause yeah, and Orson Welles in that sequence is incredible. Like he and Joseph Cotton, of course, had worked together a lot, because they were both together in Citizen Kane, of course, but then they had been together in their whole production studio before that, doing radio stuff. So like in theater stuff, like they had been working together for years. These two guys know each other, like so. In Orson Welles, this is an example, of course, where like because he's such a creative force, everyone kind of assumes that he must have like helped direct the movie, but all of the like various interviews say just like no, like he certainly influenced his own scenes, but he was pretty hands off at any other time. But his like the dynamic in that whole scene is so amazing. Watching all of these little micro expressions as you watch Harry try one approach, see that that's not working. Maybe I'm going to need to do this, but no, okay, well, okay. Oh, you know what? Now I'm going to be nice. I'm going to be the nice guy. And he's like, oh, wait, no, you told the police that. Oh, okay, well, all right. What am I gonna have to do? Well, you know what, man? And you just watch him working it out and like going, the bit where he's kind of like he opens the door of the Ferris wheel car and he can see he's like he's maybe saying like I'm going to set this up so that I can push him if I need to, but then his old friend reads his intentions and like hangs on, like puts his arm around like one of the things in the car so they couldn't just be pushed, and then you can see him kind of saying, okay, all right, you know what? Hey, what are we doing here? Whoa, isn't this crazy that we're having this tension when we're old friends? And you can see him just try to like realign it all. And um, there's a detail in that scene that I find really interesting, and it's the bit where there's a little bit of like frost on the window, and he writes Anna's name and a little heart on it. Um, and I think that's interesting because it raises the question of, is he doing that because he's really thinking about Anna and misses her? Or is it maybe performative for Holly's benefit? Because Holly had just accused him moments earlier of not caring, not only not caring that she got arrested, but that setting her up to be arrested for his own benefit. Because he had helped forge her passport, previously. And it is revealed that he basically tips off the Russian police that he had done that as kind of a way to get them off of his own back. And so Holly is basically saying, you say you loved her, but why would you do that? And so for him to, you almost feel like he's waiting to make sure that Holly sees that he writes Anna in the little, mist. Or does he really mean it? Because we could also imagine this character loving her, but not so much that he's going to sacrifice himself for her.
Well, in this movie, both things can be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He could miss her, and
Mm-hmm.
he could also see an opportunity to like kind of
Yeah.
prod Holly a little bit.
Well, and also we could imagine too that with her conflicted feelings that we saw, like it's one thing to say she would never betray him the way Holly is planning to do. But could he have really like once she finds out what he's really doing, could he have really trusted her to just be an ongoing partner under those circumstances?
Right.
Like how on board would she have been willing to be in terms of maintaining an active relationship? Because there's a difference between betraying him to the cops and continuing an ongoing relationship. And so it may be that he's sort of feeling like, I did love her, but I can't trust her to stay with me now that she knows. And so like, who knows? But all of that is kind of left ambiguous, but it's really cool. But yeah, like that scene's amazing. And of course it culminates in that incredible little speech. That was the one part that Orson Welles did specifically right, was the little anecdote about, the cuckoo clock speech, which I could probably pull up the quote for it. So yeah, in fact, it's the quote that comes up like at the top of the list because it's the obvious quote line from this movie. But he finishes that whole encounter scene saying like, "Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Like the fella says, in Italy for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock." And it's just like, it's such an amazing little speech to kind of tell us, to cement in our minds who this guy is, right? But then, of course, the betrayal does actually happen. We get the whole chase through the sewers and those amazing locations down there. just some of those incredible shots of people coming out of shadow and the lights and the water rushing around, and like it's just amazing stuff. All culminating in um, Harry has killed um, Sergeant Payne, I think. One of the guys who works for Calloway, who we like because he's competent and funny and likes Holly's books and friendly, and we sort of like him. And so now Harry has killed him, and I think in some ways, in terms of just storytelling, it is such a great threshold moment for the audience to understand that yeah, Harry has to die now, right? Like he can't continue. He can't be allowed to get away in the movie after doing that. Like it would be one thing we could maybe get on board with, somehow he gets away in an ending up until that moment, I think. Does that read to you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of how I took it too. Is like, okay, and that's also what gives us comfort in that, like understanding why Holly ends up being like
Mm-hmm.
the one who ultimately has to
Yeah.
kill him,
Um,
right?
and it's kind of amazing too because we get such a little micro roller coaster of emotion in that last sequence with him, because we've been watching for almost like 10 minutes, I think, just this him getting chased through the sewers and stuff like that. Um, and so he's killed Payne, he's run off, but he's also just gotten shot in the back, and so we see him like crawling along, trying to go up the spiral staircase to the one hatch that isn't guarded, but got a grate on it that he doesn't have the strength to move. And so there's just this moment of his fingers kind of reaching up through the grate, and like just his fingers get the taste of the freedom that he's not going to be able to make. And then ultimately, Holly comes along, and it's interesting because apparently some of the edits when they made this, like the American producers were saying, we need to remove any suggestion that it's a mercy killing, and it's kind of weird to hear that because it seems still pretty obvious in the movie. It's just such a great little wordless moment from Wells where he and Holly both hear Calloway saying to shoot him. Calloway's yelling from another tunnel, doesn't see this happening, and we have just seen Harry realize, I'm not going to be able to get away. I'm shot. I'm in pain. What are my choices right now? And when he hears Calloway call for him to be shot, he kind of just gives, Holly a look and like, go ahead. And yeah, and then it doesn't happen on screen, I think, is maybe the big thing, is that, we cut away, we hear the shot from Calloway's perspective, and then Holly comes walking back in. But then the ending with this amazing pairing of, like we had seen at the beginning, Holly went to Harry's funeral. What he thought was Harry's funeral, we know now was faked, right? But Anna was there. And then he gets approached by Calloway, and in Calloway's Jeep, they drive past Anna, and that all happens in that first sequence. And so now we get all of that repeated, but under a new context, because now we know Harry actually is in there. There's an interesting detail that I realized only in this viewing, which is that the first time she does not accept a little spoonful of dirt to dump on the coffin, like as kind of a funeral thing. Like sometimes family members or loved ones are allowed to put a little bit of the dirt
Right.
ceremonially on the coffin, but she declines. It's offered to her, and she turns away and doesn't do it the first time. She does do it the second time, and that I don't think it's because she knew he wasn't in there the first time, because we see her learn that he's alive, and I think her reaction is genuine in that moment. But in any case, she does do it the second time. But then, uh, driving past her again, we get this amazing moment where Holly decides, I'm not going to leave. I'm going to wait for her. And we get this incredible, incredible long shot of him waiting by this Jeep, her walking in from the background, and he's waiting for her to come. But then after this long time of her just walking towards the camera, she just walks right by him without even looking. And then
Oh,
he just kind of has to light the cigarette, and that's the end. Amazing, amazing, incredible ending. I think in this movie, I love this movie so much. It's great.
it's so good. Yeah, I mean, it just it's such a fun experience.
Hmm.
You know? So
Yeah, and of course, anyone who hasn't watched it, we've of course just gone through all of the details, of course. But the thing that is very difficult to convey in just the discussion like this is that the visuals, the use of light and shadow, and like you mentioned tilting camera. There's a lot of tilted camera in this movie. It's just amazing. The This is a like a visual masterpiece. It's great. And it's one of the rare noir films not set in the U.S. It's but the location is just so interesting, and it's that they didn't have to build sets of bombed out buildings because there really were them. There really were them. There really were bombed out buildings in Vienna at the time. But yeah, oh, here's the thing that we the only thing that has been said on this so far is that you included music in the list of things that this movie does in a really interesting way. Music in this movie,
it's
the
awesome.
entire score is done on a zither, which is kind of an unusual, or at least to American ears, an unusual stringed instrument that sounds maybe a little bit like a combination ukulele banjo thing, maybe a little bit harpsichordy. But they found apparently this local zither player, and they just thought his music sounded really cool and moody, and so they just hired him to score the entire movie. The entire movie's music is all played on a single zither, and that's what the music is. And I know I when I first watched the movie, I kind of couldn't get over it. I was like, this is a weird choice. The music is strange, and it like I wasn't sure that I didn't like it, but I kept getting kind of thrown off by how unusual it was.
Yeah,
But I have really come to love it as being just part of this movie's fingerprint.
I agree.
All right, cool. So with Rashomon and the Third Man under our belts, let's pick another two movies to watch for next time. I think we can go back to this Sight and Sound greatest films of all time list, and I think once again I'm going to choose a movie that I have heard a lot about, but have never actually watched, and that is Metropolis, the
Mm.
science fiction black and white silent film that influenced a lot of science fiction visually, and I've kind of always heard that, but I've never actually gone back and watched it. So I think that's my choice. Um, I'm trying to find it on the list right now because to where what number it was, because I know it's on there. I've seen it before, seen it on the list before. But have you picked one?
So I was looking at a couple. Have we done? Have we done the good, the bad, and the ugly?
We have not.
I think that would be fun, like just because we've done a couple of westerns,
Mm-hmm.
and it's got just really. I mean, I know we've done some that are like, oh, this is the spaghetti western that's just like
Like we
above,
did Unforgiven, which was on the AFI list, right?
right. But
Mm-hmm.
the good, the bad, and the ugly is like
Mm-hmm.
fun spaghetti western, and it's
Yeah.
been a very long time since I've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what.
All right. So let's see. So Metropolis is number 67 on the this Sight and Sound list. I can was the good, the bad. The good, the bad, and the ugly doesn't have to be on. There it is.
It's
So
on here.
it's 169.
Yeah.
I was just about to say though, like that in principle, like if we found that it was not on the list, that would not be disqualifying. Like we could still talk about it, right? We don't have to only do movies on the list, but yes, it is on the list at number 169. 1966, Sergio Leone, Leone, is it Leone or Leone? Do you know?
Leone. Yeah.
Leone, and starring young Clint Eastwood. Um, and that's another one that like you said, I haven't seen it in a long time either. But yeah, so that'll be great. Metropolis is the Fritz Lang silent film from what year was it? I just had it. 1927. But then and then Good, Mad, and the Ugly. So sounds good.
Yep.
All right.
1966. Made in Italy, even though it is a American
Mm,
Western. I think like just that genre
yeah.
is.
Well, gives us the opportunity to talk about the so-called spaghetti westerns.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So I think with that in the bag, we'll sign off for this time. And while you wait for our next episode, everyone, watch good movies.
Good movies.